I forget to do here. So now we're recording. Thank you. And for those of you who are taking it for credit, the main textbook, well, for everyone who wants to, of course, if you're surveying, you don't have to do any work before coming to class. But if you do want to do some work with the course, this is the main textbook, 4 portraits, 1 Jesus, 2nd edition, Mark Strauss, published by Zondervan. Okay? And there's also a workbook associated with this. So if you're taking it for credit, you need to keep pace with the workbook. Okay, every so often, I'd like you to bring your workbook to class with you, because I will periodically check to see whether you're keeping pace where we are in the course. So whatever we're going to discuss that week, you should have read the material in Strauss. Again, only talking to those taking the course for credit. You're going to have read the material in Strauss assigned for that class before the class, and also write in your workbook the answers to that, okay, for that particular section. There also is a, for those again taking it for credit, a paper, as you'll see in the syllabus. We'll talk about that more maybe next week. And then there will be a final exam. That's right. That's when you fear God. Don't fear human beings, Jesus said. Right? Who can merely kill you or give you a bad grade in the exam. But fear God, who can do what? Send both body and soul to a bad place. Okay? So don't fear me. I am nobody. All right, so today, this week and next week, we're going to focus on the background material in early Judaism and a little bit of Greco-Roman stuff as it relates to the Gospels. Okay? And today we're going to focus primarily on the history part of it, and next week a little bit more on institutions and various trends of thought. Okay, so this week and next week is background in Judaism that we need in order to move ahead with the text. Okay, very first movement. Why is it not moving, advancing? I give up. It was working fine before. Oh, what did we do?
Just click this.
Oh, click that. Oh, now it works. Oh, okay. I'm so grateful that you're here. All right. So we're going to start by just briefly reviewing some material. You note 4 great empires from the time of Israel's exile to Babylon on. Of course, Babylonian exile. So Persian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, and they are under the thumb of Babylon 605 to 539 BC. Then we have the Persian Empire replacing that, Cyrus defeating the Babylonians. A return back to the land is then allowed by Cyrus. And by the way, this is being recorded too, so you'll have this on, in fact, everyone will get a copy of the, after this is recorded later tonight, I will put it on YouTube as a private recording, and I will send you all that link so that you can access it anytime. Israel returns back to the land in successive waves. Next great empire is the Greek Empire. Alexander the Great's conquest, we'll talk a little bit about that. Included here is the Maccabean Revolt from 167 BC on. We are going to talk about that, which leads to independent rule in Israel again, 141 to 63. Then the Roman Empire, 63 BC under Pompey, now takes control of Palestine or Israel. Of course, during this time, we have the beginnings of Christianity, and Roman rule is until 313 AD. And then Judea is under Christian Byzantine rule until Arab Muslims conquered Jerusalem in 631. So with that exception of that little period of time of independent Hasmonean rule from 141 to 63. Other than that time, Israel is under one empire or another until the rise of the state of Israel in 1948. So it's just a little sliver of independence, relatively speaking. So we're going to focus now on rule by the Greeks. Nice thing about Persian rule is that they interfered only minimally with the internal politics inside the nation of Israel. They allowed self-rule. And that continued under Persian dominance for 2 centuries. Then Alexander the Great, young man, conquers the Persian Empire, Greek, technically Macedonian Greek. And here's a nice little picture of that, a mosaic that dates from 100 BC and depicts the Battle of Issus when the Persian ruler Darius is defeated. And let's see, I actually can, you can see here, so where is my face is covering Alexander. There's Alexander. No, this is the Persian guy here. Alexander's right here. This horse, and that great little mosaic in the House of the Faun in Pompeii. One of the nice things about Pompeii is the volcano covered it with lava and that it was preserved very well. So the best preserved city we have from the ancient world. So in a very short period of time, a decade, Alexander then creates the largest empire that's known to the world up to that point. It extends from Greece, if you can believe it, all the way to India. It's extraordinary. And to Egypt in the south. When he visited Egypt, he stopped off at a temple and he was proclaimed to be a god by the priest there, given divine honors. Alexander apparently did not have a low self-image. Here's the extent of the rule of under Alexander the Great, the extent of territory conquered. You can see all the way from Macedonia in the west, Egypt in the south, all the way to the borders of India in the east. Extraordinary conquest. And that began a very important process, which we call Hellenization. Hellenization is the spread of everything Greek. It comes from the word Hellas, meaning Greek. And Hellenization is primarily spread through the establishment of Greek-styled cities across the new empire, of which the greatest of these is named after Alexander himself, Alexandria in Egypt. And that will be one of the, by the time of Jesus, Alexandria is one of the 3 great cities of the world. Of course, the greatest is Rome, and then vying for the second slot is Alexandria in Egypt. And anyone know what the other city is? No. Carthage has already been destroyed by this point, not Athens. It's in Syria, Antioch. And that will turn out to be the place for the second great center of the early church after Jerusalem. Will be the establishment of the church in Antioch. So Hellenization is a spread of Greek culture all across the board. We're talking about the spread of Greek language, Greek architecture, Greek politics, Greek philosophy, Greek entertainment, Greek athletics with the gymnasiums, Greek religion, Greek art, everything Greek. Greek becomes the fashionable item in the East. So quite naturally then, this process of Hellenization inaugurates the Hellenistic age, which is really only succeeded ultimately by Rome with the Roman imperial age. But even the Roman imperial age continues to borrow heavily from the Hellenized world. That's why the aristocracy in Israel isn't going to primarily know Latin. Roman administrative officials, certainly Pontius Pilate knows Latin as a Roman, but otherwise the upper crust will know Greek, but still in pockets of the East, including in Israel, the main lingua franca remains from the Persian Empire, Aramaic. But Greek is still fairly well known, to the extent, for example, that Spanish is known here in Texas. Now, unfortunately for Alexander, he didn't last too long. He died at a relatively young age, 323 BC, and then his empire was divided up into his generals. And we really don't need to know much about what happened in Greece and Anatolia, because both of those went through considerable transition over time. For our purposes, what's most important is what happened in Syria and lands east, and in Egypt. And the two generals here that we need to know is Seleucus in Syria for the Seleucid Empire. Seleucus I establishes the Seleucid Empire in Syria and lands east. And then Ptolemy I, who uses the epithet soter, savior, obviously, again, not somebody with a low self-image, this is the opposite problem, begins the dynasty of the Ptolemaic dynasty. So the reign of the Ptolemies in Egypt. And here you can see the divisions as it breaks out here. Now, what we see here for Syria and lands east, some point in time, Parthia is going to assert itself, and it's going to radically reduce the territory of the Seleucid Empire, moving from east to west, and will eventually pose a major threat to the Roman Empire. That's a picture of Ptolemy I. Now, under basically what happened in the 3rd century, so the 200s BC, Israel was under the thumb of the Ptolemaic Empire, so under Egyptian rule. Fortunately, at this period of time, there was a policy practiced by the Ptolemies, and by the way, they named all the male kings were named Ptolemy, and all the female queens were named Cleopatra. Just a question of number, what number you want to give them. Oh, well, some of them were Arsinoe and Berenike. Okay, correct myself here. And they practiced pretty much the same policy as the Persians. Give us our money, otherwise we're hands off and we're not going to do anything. We'll let you run your own country. And at this period of time, another important thing is happening. A lot of Jews are voluntarily emigrating from Palestine to Egypt. They're not being forced. They're not going by forced exile. They're voluntarily doing so. So is Egypt over time, and especially in Alexandria, Egypt, over time, gathers a considerably large Jewish population. And here's a picture of the empire, two empires around 275 BC. In green, you see the Seleucid Empire, and in sort of reddish color, the Ptolemaic Empire. Now that hands-off policy changes completely around 200 BC. That's when the Seleucid kingdom, Syria and lands east, defeats the Ptolemaic kingdom and acquires the land of Palestine under its control. Again, capital in Antioch. And this happens under the ruler Antiochus III. Now, again, the first ruler, you can see a picture of here, of this empire in the late 4th century BC was Seleucus I. Again, that's why they call it the Seleucid Empire. Antiochus is a descendant of his. And yes, so here we have a picture again of the Seleucid Empire here under the reign of Antiochus. And you can see now they take control of Coal Syria and Palestine, south of that. So at this point, rule has changed from which empire? Ptolemaic Empire to the Seleucid Empire. That is, rule has been replaced from Egypt now to Syria and lands east. Okay, and here's a bust of Antiochus III. Now, problem that Antiochus III encounters is, although he's able to conquer Egypt, not the whole of the Ptolemaic Empire, but wrest Palestine from Egypt, and some other territories. He now comes up against the Romans. The Romans are now asserting themselves eastward. And so Antiochus III attempts to take over Asia Minor. That's the area we call Turkey here. Asia Minor does not mean this context China, Japan, Southeast Asia. It means Turkey. Okay? And Asia would be the province on the western side of Anatolia or Turkey. In his attempt to take over what we call Turkey, Rome drew a line in the sand, figuratively, and said, it's not going to happen, and imposed reparations on the Syrians. Now remember, we're saying Syrians here, we're saying Greek Syrians. These are Greek rulers, a Greek aristocracy over a native population. And they imposed the reparations in 188. So after Antiochus III passed, then his son Seleucus IV ruled for less than a decade, 8 years. Then he died, and his younger brother Antiochus IV then began ruling. This is where you should say boo, hiss, okay? Because this is a very bad man. This is the worst of them. Almost makes Nero look like a really nice guy by comparison. And so then the Seleucid Empire has to get money to pay the reparations. That's in part what leads to the problems for Israel. And here's a picture of Antiochus IV. You can see the bust to the right and coin on the left. The coin on the left reads, of King or belonging to King Antiochus, God manifest. Okay, so they call him Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Epiphanes means manifest, that is divinity revealed. Again, this guy is a megalomaniac, no other way of putting it. The Jews, however, referred to him not as Epiphanes, God manifest, but Epimanes, madman. So he begins by meddling with the high priesthood in Jerusalem. That's a big no-no because the priests are very important for Jewish society. And he took the high priesthood from a man by the name of Onias III. Onias was a Zadokite. A Zadokite means a priest that descended from the line of Zadok. Anyone know who Zadok is? Anyone? Zadok was the high priest under David, co-high priest under David, sole high priest under Solomon. From that point on, it was understood that the high priest had to be descended not just from the line of Aaron, Zadok was a descendant of Aaron, but had to be descended from that particular line of Aaron, the Zadokite line. So Antiochus IV took it away from Onias III and gave it to his brother, Jason, Yason. I'll let you in on a little secret, by the way. There's no J sound in Greek or in Hebrew. What do you think that means for Jesus? All the J sounds are Y sounds. How do we get the J? Through the Germans, who used J for Y. So blame it on the Germans. We should all be saying either Yeshua for Jesus, would be the Hebrew, or the Greek Jesus. But I realize I'm swimming upstream on that battle. But I say, why not? We can say why. It's not a hard consonant for us to say, but oh well. And Jason gets the high priesthood because he bribes Antiochus IV, and that means with money from the temple. And that's what the Seleucid Empire needs at this point to pay reparations to the Romans. And also requires out of Jason, Yason, an agreement to convert Jerusalem now into a Greek city. So he builds a gymnasium. Both athletics and education of youth is conducted in a gymnasium. This gymnasium is built near the temple. Males are exercising, they're wrestling, and all the exercise is being done in the nude. That was the Greek way. But that was scandalous to Jewish sensibilities. And Greek schools were established also to train the youth. They even had a special Greek hat for the young nobles to wear, to parade around. At some point, Antiochus then replaced Jason as high priest with a different high priest, Menelaus. Unlike Jason and Onias, Menelaus, although from the Aaronite line, was not from the Zadokite line of Aaron. So that became a major problem. And shortly thereafter, he also had Onias III executed. So there would be no pretension back to the throne. Still, Antiochus needs more money. And there's been resistance in Israel to this process of Hellenization. So to punish the nation and to acquire more money, Antiochus, coming back from a battle with the Egyptians, passing through Palestine, stops in Jerusalem and loots the temple in 169 and slaughters all Jews attempting to resist what he's doing. And I can see that the tensions now are ratcheting up considerably at this point. And in 167 BC, Antiochus said, I'm tired of waiting for this Hellenization to occur, so I'm going to issue a decree, and not just for Israel, but for all the population, native populations under our rule, that they are all to give up their customs and now going to institute a policy of forced Hellenization. We're not asking you or inviting you anymore. It's now required. Sort of like where we're headed with the US government right now. You just got to give it a little more time. The US government is basically working towards compelled speech at this point, for example, with regard to transgenderism. And it's going to get a lot worse from there, but we'll have plenty of time to throw little side issues like that out in the course. And this even went so far as outlawing the Jewish religion. That meant that Antiochus made it a capital offense, death penalty, for Jews in the empire. And then, by the way, by this point in time, there are a lot of Jews throughout the empire, what we call the diaspora, the dispersion or scattering of Jews throughout the Roman Empire. Not yet fully the Roman Empire. You can get the death sentence for circumcising your male babies. Well, that's the entry right into the covenant. That's a big one. For observing dietary law, and the particular test case that was used was eating pork. Jews were not supposed to eat pork. And so to show that you have abandoned Jewish faith, show us by eating pork. He outlawed observing the Sabbath and any Jewish festivals. And even the very study of the Torah and scripture itself could get you a death sentence. So it's about as bad as it could possibly be. I'm playing for all the marbles here as to whether or not the nation of Israel will even survive. This is where you find out who has a bold witness and who does not. By the way, as I told you, when I was growing up, I grew up in a Catholic household, and I can still remember, so I have to chuckle a little bit at it, but in the first grade, the nun telling us, if somebody were to walk through that room right now with a pistol and say, I'll shoot anyone who says that I'm a follower of Jesus, what would you do? I don't know, I'm only 6. You know, I was terrified. When was that going to happen? But it did prepare me in life. So he also had Torah scrolls destroyed. Unfortunately, we lost some manuscript base at that point. He forced, as I mentioned, Jews to sacrifice, well, not just to eat, but to sacrifice pigs at shrines. You're not supposed to sacrifice anything outside the temple. to a deity. But not only that, but you're going to sacrifice pigs at shrines erected to idols throughout the various towns of Judea. He compelled Jews to celebrate a festival of Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and fertility and ecstasy. And the worst of all, this is what really is heartening to the nation, is on top of the altar of burnt offering, the altar in front of the sanctuary, on which there would be daily burnt offerings, twice daily, as required by the law, given up to Yahweh. On that altar, in front of the temple, some sort of idolatrous, we don't know all the details, but some sort of idolatrous pagan altar was built on top of the altar of burnt offering and dedicated to the high god of the Greek pantheon, Zeus. And on that altar, they sacrificed swine. So this is pretty bad. Now that event, what they did to the altar in front of the temple, became known to Jews as the abomination of desolation, the shekutz shomein in Hebrew. Literally, that makes desolate. Technically, it's a participle. See how pedantic I can be? I need more bran in my diet. Now, and why is it called an abomination of desolation? Because it caused Jews to abandon the temple precincts, the upkeep of the temple, and even to a large measure, Jerusalem. It became like a ghost town because of what they were doing to the temple. And we have that mentioned in 2 texts in 1 Maccabees. Now, there are other ways you could translate this. You could translate it the desolating sacrilege or the desolating monstrosity. There are different ways that it could be rendered. We do also hear this expression used in the book of Daniel in chapters 11 and 12, and also in 1 Maccabees 1, Daniel 9 also, the abominations of one who makes desolate, and an alternate variation of it in Daniel 8, the transgression that makes desolate. So Daniel himself, the second half of Daniel, chapter 7 to 12, makes frequent reference to this act. Now, it's also possible you might render it the appalling abomination or the abomination that causes horror or destruction. But the Greek translations of the Hebrew text indicate, no, it's more the sense of making desolate or desolation, and also the descriptions of the deserted temple complex that we have in 2 texts in 1 Maccabees suggest that. But at the same time, multiple meanings might be in view. So we could have more than one here. And possibly it's also a pun on the title Baal Shamein, which means Lord of Heaven, referring to the high Phoenician god, Baal Hadad, who is being identified in this period of time with the Greek god Zeus. So that may have also contributed to this particular designation. The first century Jewish historian, Josephus, speaks about Antiochus having built on the outer temple altar a pagan altar, a bomas, on which he slaughtered swine on it. Now, there's no explicit mention of an idol being erected on the altar. Some later Christian and Jewish tradition posits a statue of Zeus being erected in the temple, not on the altar. But what's probably likely here is that images and symbols of Zeus are being put on this added pagan altar structure on top of the altar of burnt offering. And of course, that defiles it, as does the fact that they're sacrificing pigs on it, as does the fact that they're doing that in dedication to Zeus. All of that is incredibly defiling of the temple complex. At this point in time, the temple is the center of Judaism. We have an entire book that's largely dealing with the importance of that issue. Others dealt with other issues as well. But the primary law in the book of Deuteronomy is centralizing the cult in the place in which God puts his name. Doesn't say where at that time, probably started originally in Shechem, then Shiloh, and then ultimately in Jerusalem. And that's understood as the one and only place where God's name or glory is present. It is a way in which God operates so that he can still be present among his people without destroying them, right? There was a time before the fall in which God and humans dwelt together. And as a result of the fall and the expulsion of humans, the rest of history in this age is God trying to work with humans and his own holiness to make his home among humans. And we see the book of Revelation ending with God finally and fully making his home among human beings. And that is the ultimate resolution, the ultimate consummation of all the hopes that have gone before. But now the place where God has made his home is being radically defiled by pagans. And we find this name, this is so important, that this reference to the abomination of desolation will appear in the great eschatological discourse of Jesus in Mark 13, the longest extended set of sayings of Jesus in Mark's gospel, where Jesus is on the Mount of Olives and looking west at the Temple Mount and prophesying its destruction. And at one point in verse 14, Jesus says to his disciples, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not. Now, why did I render that he? I rendered that he because the Greek participle standing is masculine. Abomination, the word that it's modifying, should be modifying, is neuter. So it's a deliberate reference to say we're not talking about a thing anymore. That means we're no longer simply talking about a pagan altar dedicated to Zeus on top of the altar of the burnt offering. Its meaning has oscillated somewhat. There's a new abomination of desolation, seems to involve a person. And then Mark parenthetically adds to the Jesus saying in Greek, let the reader understand. Now that's Mark saying it because Jesus isn't talking to a reader. He's talking to his disciples who are present with him. It's Mark who adds, let the reader understand. And that's his way of saying to his audience, probably will suggest in writing of Mark's gospel, around 70, which is the year in which the Second Temple, the great wonder of the world, the Second Temple, finally completed, begun by Herod the Great, is destroyed in 70. And Mark says, let the reader understand. Now, maybe one argument is that this involves competing zealot groups. The actual indictment that we find somewhat obliquely referenced in Mark, but also explained in Josephus, is made, not you would think in the first instance, be made against the Romans who are destroying the temple. But actually the indictment in the first instance here is being made against the zealot forces that are fighting among themselves for who is going to be the leader of the rebellion against Rome, while Rome has Jerusalem encircled and is nearing its destruction. Jews, zealot forces within the temple precincts are killing each other off. That may be what Mark is saying, what Jesus is saying, this is the abomination of desolation. It's now being committed not by a pagan power, it's being committed by Jews, fellow Jews. Might be to a messianic claimant, among the zealots. That did pop up. That's one suggestion. I'm not saying categorically I know that to be the case, but I'm throwing that out as a possibility at this point. By the way, you did exactly what you should do. You should say it right then. Don't even wait. Question and answer time. Now, the first pagan sacrifice was offered on that altar on the 25th day of Chislev. What do we know December 25th to be? Christmas. Well, doesn't quite work out that way here, but there may be some oblique connection. The month straddles, Chislev straddles November, December, and it really turns out to be December 14th in that particular year of 167 BC. But that is a moment that they pinpoint. That's when the disaster reaches its culminating height, when that pagan sacrifice is offered on the altar. And it coincides with Antiochus IV's birthday, by the way. Then Antiochus develops tests of obedience to his decree outlawing Judaism, requiring Jews to eat pork, do work on the Sabbath, stop circumcising their newborn males, and even to sacrifice to idols. What would you do in that setting if somebody came here and required you, for example, to curse Jesus, to renounce Christ to the world? I see lots of Christians nowadays actually diluting their faith even when they're not under persecution. That's the real shame. That is unbelievable, but it does occur. Not here, I trust. Now, what that means is then these points of contention become very critical in developing Judaism after this point in time. When you think about Paul, for example, developing law-free Gentile communities in which the Gentiles are not required to circumcise. In fact, he tells them not to circumcise, not to eat, not to follow the dietary regulations, even Sabbath, according to Romans 14. I know I'll probably pray for me in this one, but in Romans 14, Paul does say, the strong understand rightly that all days are alike. All days, including Jewish festival days and the Sabbath. That's an interesting development. But things like calendar, diet, circumcision. You see why Paul's saying that Jews and Gentiles don't have to continue in that? How that would upset Jews, many of whom were martyred because of their faithfulness to the commands around these matters. And now you're just going to give it up? You, Paul, a former Pharisee? You can see why that would create a problem, even among Jewish Christians. Which is why Paul wasn't quite so sure how things would turn out when he went to Jerusalem to deliver the collection. And so circumcision, diet, and calendar, not just rejection of idolatry, but some of these other issues, moved up to the front of the line as important matters, indicating fidelity and resistance to apostasy, because they became the test case over whether or not you would commit apostasy in the faith. So they became what we call boundary or identity markers of a faithful Jew. So a time of great persecution, as you can imagine, ensued for Jews who refused to apostatize. Examples: women who had their sons circumcised would have their sons put around their neck, and their son would be hurled from the city walls to their death. Jews who assembled in caves to just observe the Sabbath, not do any work, were burned alive. in the caves. That's right. All this is happening during the persecution of Antiochus, 167, 160 to 165. And we have riveting stories about an old priest by the name of Eleazar and a mother and her 7 sons who, under pain of torture for refusing to eat pork as an example of apostasy, undergo excruciating deaths for the faith. And here's example text from 2 Maccabees 6, written about 125 BC. So no more than 40 years after the events. Eleazar, one of the scribes in high position, a man now advanced in age and noble presence, was being forced to open his mouth to eat swine's flesh. But he, welcoming death with honor rather than life with pollution, went up to the rack of his own accord, spitting out the swine flesh out of his mouth. Those who were in charge privately urged him to pretend that he was eating the flesh of the sacrificial meal. You don't have to really eat it, just pretend you're chewing. But he declared himself quickly, telling them to send him to Hades instead. Such pretense, he said, is not worthy of our time of life. Yeah, granted, I'm an old man, so, though I go a little bit sooner than I expected, but I'm already advanced in age. But how is this going to impact everybody else, especially the young? What kind of message am I sending to them about the faith? For many of the young might suppose that Eleazar, myself, in my 90th year, had gone over to an alien religion. And through my pretense, pretending I'm chewing, for the sake of living a brief moment longer, they would be led astray because of me. And I would defile and disgrace my old age. Whether I live or die, I will not escape the hands of the Almighty. Therefore, by bravely giving up my life now, I will leave to the young a noble example of how to die a good death for the holy laws. And when he had said this, he went at once to the rack. And when he was about to die under the blows, he groaned aloud. And he said, I am enduring terrible sufferings in my body under this beating, but in my soul, I am glad to suffer these things because I fear God. And in this way he died, leaving in his death an example of nobility and a memorial of courage, not only to the young, but to the great body of the nation. It happened also that 7 brothers and their mother were arrested, and they were being compelled by the king under whips and thongs to partake of swine's flesh. And one of them, one of the sons, one of the brothers, acting as a spokesman, said, we are ready to die rather than transgress the laws of our ancestors. And the king fell into a rage, and he gave orders to have pans and cauldrons heated. And he commanded that the tongue of their spokesman be cut out, and that they scalp him and cut off his hands and his feet, while the rest of his brothers and his mother looked on. And when he was utterly helpless, the king ordered them to take him to the fire, still breathing, and to fry him in a pan. The smoke from the pan spread widely, but the brothers and their mother encouraged one another to die nobly. Then they brought forward the second for their sport. They tore up the skin of his head, and he underwent tortures, and at his last breath he said, the king of the universe will raise us up to an everlasting renewal of life because we have died for his laws. The third was the victim of their sport as well. And when it was demanded, he quickly put out his tongue and courageously stretched forth his hands. And he said nobly, I got these from heaven. And because of his laws, I now disdain them. From him, I hope to get them back again. And after he too had died, they maltreated and tortured the fourth, And when he was near death, he said, one cannot but choose to cherish the hope that God gives of being raised again. But for you, Antiochus, there will be no resurrection to life. Next, they brought forward the fifth and maltreated him. And after they brought forward the sixth, when he was about to die, he said, we are suffering because of our sins against our own God. Not for the sins of the nation, God would not let this happen. So in a sense, it's not Antiochus doing it to us, but it's God using Antiochus as an agent. This is a well-worn theological view by the prophets in the exilic and post-exilic periods. The mother was especially admirable. Although she saw her sons perish within a single day, she bore it with good courage because of her hope in the Lord. And she encouraged each of them. It was not I who gave you life. The creator of the world will give life and breath back to you again, since you now forget yourselves for the sake of the laws. The youngest brother being still alive, Antiochus promised that he would make him rich if he would just turn from the ways of his ancestors. The king called to the mother. Tell him, urge to advise her son to save himself. But leaning close to him, she spoke in their native language, Aramaic. Accept death so that in God's mercy, I may get you back again, along with your brothers. The young man said, I will not obey the king's command. We are suffering because of our own sins. If our living Lord is angry for a little while to rebuke and to discipline us, he will again be reconciled. Our brothers, after enduring a brief suffering, have drunk of ever-flowing life, but you will receive just punishment. I give up body for the laws, appealing to God to show mercy soon to our nation, and through me and my brothers to bring to an end the wrath of the Almighty that is justly fallen on the whole nation. So he died, and last of all, the mother died after her sons. The whole book is later written just about this 2 chapters in 2 Maccabees 6-7. It's written about a century or so after 2 Maccabees. But the whole book revolves around telling and expanding the story about the martyrdom of this scribe priest, Eleazar, and the mother and her 7 sons. And so it's particularly important here is the atonement theology that we find built in. For example, in chapter 6, the priest Eleazar cries out, let our punishment suffice for them. Make my blood their purification and take my life in exchange for theirs. When you hear that, what do you think about? Who did that in the greatest way possible? Jesus did that. His punishment sufficed for ours. His blood brought our purification. His life was given in exchange for ours. That's atonement. That's atonement theology. Word there, in exchange for theirs, antipsukon, literally instead of their soul. At the end of the book, 4th Maccabees, the martyred Eleazar and the mother and her 7 sons are honored by the fact that the tyrant was visited with vengeance. He was punished by God, and the ancestral land was cleansed or purified, and they became, as it were, a ransom. And the same term, antipsukon, literally a soul or life in exchange. A ransom for the sin of the nation. And through the blood of those pious ones, and through the atoning sacrifice, Greek word there is hilasterion, which is used of Christ's death in Romans 3:25. Christ's death is called a hilasterion, an atoning sacrifice. Hilasterion is related as it's a substantival adjective functioning as a noun, literally the atoning or propitiating or what I'm thinking of here, expiating thing, i.e. sacrifice, offering. And sometimes translates by some as mercy seat. I think that's incorrect, although the term hilasterion is used for mercy seat. But there are various reasons why I would recommend take a course of E.M. Paul sometime, why it probably means what it means here, which is not mercy seat, but an atoning sacrifice. It's the, yeah, I'll leave it at that. So why did I spend so much time on this? Because there are two major consequences that come from these stories of martyrdom. They're telling and they're retelling in Judaism in the most cataclysmic moment of Jewish history that strongly affect the understanding of what Christ does for us. Up till this point in time, there's really not any clear discussion, for example, about resurrection from the dead. The earliest reference we have to resurrection appears in Daniel 12. I think Daniel 12 is probably written around this time, 165 BC. There are various reasons for that. And atonement at this point is largely restricted to understanding Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. But we do have echoing of atonement theology at various points in Israel's history. But it especially coalesces at this moment, where the martyrs believe, because they have not apostatized, they have been faithful. So in that sense, in that limited sense, they're innocent, even though they refer to our sins because they're part of the nation. They believe that their act of fidelity under excruciating torture will offset the infidelity of the Hellenizing nation, their lives in exchange for others. Ultimately, for the sins of the world to be addressed, you have to have somebody that's not just sinless with respect to a particular matter, but somebody who is the completely unblemished Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world, and who is in his identity the Son of God and Messiah. His life on the scales of justice outweigh all the other lives of all the rest of humanity. That's how great he is. And it's why he alone can make that offering, because only his life can be given in exchange for all the rest of humanity. See how it's important to read these texts to understand developments in thought, or the way Christians are going to view Christ's death, the way Christ himself views his death, both in the line that the Son of Mark 10:45, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many, a life in exchange for our lives, he enduring for us the judgment that would otherwise be inflicted on us for our sins. And then at the greatest moment of all, prior to the cross, the Last Supper, in the liturgy over the cup. This, Jesus says in Mark, followed by Matthew, this is my blood of the covenant. Blood of the covenant. What would any Jew think in the first century when they heard that? They would think of the Sinai covenant ratification ceremony. When Moses, after the law has been given on Sinai, pours half a vat of blood on the altar, signifying God's involvement in the covenant, and does what with the other half? Yeah, you just imagine if I had here a big vat of blood, and I took a big plant of hyssop, and I approached you, and I splattered your clothes with that blood. I'm just guessing. I may not be invited back again to Second Baptist. I don't know. Or at least I'm going to have some dry cleaning bill. Right? You don't know what this guy did? Well, that's what Moses did. And you can bet that they never forgot that day. And that signaled their involvement in it. Now, partly that signified this will happen to you, what happened to the sacrifices if you don't carry out the terms of the covenant. But it also, over time, signified an atoning, amends-making death, the sacrifices in exchange for their life, purifying them and allowing them to be in covenant with Yahweh. What is covenant, by the way, in a word? Anyone know? Begins with K. No? Covenant, maybe I didn't hear it, didn't hear it.
Kinship.
Who said kinship? Somebody in the ethosphere out there. Kinship is exactly correct. Covenant is kinship. One of the best lectures I ever heard by a teacher of mine from Harvard, Frank Moore-Cross, came to Princeton when I was a doctoral student at the seminary and gave a lecture on covenant as kinship. Blew us all away. That's really what covenant is. Covenant is the extension of kinship across bloodlines. Classic example of covenant, marriage. Two otherwise blood unrelated people become kin, superseding any previous kinship tie. What's another example of covenant as kinship? Adoption. Somebody blood unrelated becomes a member of your family. We have some examples even in the Hebrew Bible where lineages are grafted in. That's covenant. People previously blood unrelated become kin. Somewhat of a fictive development, but it also has real consequences, which is namely that all the obligations and the privileges associated with being a kin now attain to you. When God liberates his people from bondage at the Exodus, and is expected in the future, that's the role of a kin. Your kin is sold into slavery and you have the wherewithal to get them out of it, you have to do it. You have to pay for their release. You have to redeem them. And that's what God does for his people, because the greatest of all kinship formulas is this: I will be your God, and you will be my people. I'm already in that mode. Don't stop me now. Yeah, that word, primarily means in its original usage, kin. The Yahweh, the kindred of Yahweh. Isn't that wonderful to be family to God? Two consequences of this martyrdom. One is a developing belief in bodily resurrection as a reward for faithfulness in the midst of persecution. Also expressed in Daniel 12:2. That's the only clear mention of a literal resurrection from the dead in the entirety of the Hebrew Bible. There are metaphorical uses like the raising of the dry bones, for example, in Ezekiel, but that's a metaphor for the nation's revival. First actual occurrence of the doctrine of the resurrection, not until Daniel 12. Second consequence is accelerating the notion of martyrdom as a form of atonement. And by atonement, we mean the making of amends, the making of restitution. Now, you will often hear that the atonement is many things. That is incorrect. The atonement is not many things. There are many consequences of the atonement: reconciliation, justification by faith, victory over the powers, spiritual powers. Those are all consequences of the atonement. They're not the atonement qua atonement, but they occur as a result of the atonement taking place. How do we know that? Because Paul in Romans 5 talks about being justified by Christ's blood and being reconciled by means of his death. So the justification and the reconciliation don't accomplish the atonement. They're the byproducts of the atonement. They're by means of Christ's blood or death. That is his atoning death. That's what blood is a reference to. Christ's atoning death accomplishes reconciliation, accomplishes justification by faith. So what is it that accomplishes it? Well, there are two root metaphors behind it. One has to do with a cultic metaphor, sacrificial offerings, and the other has to do with sort of a military or commercial metaphor of redemption or enslavement, paying the price of somebody's release, restitution. So amends making and restitution. Hilasterion, sacrificial, atoning sacrifice terminology, and the terminology of redemption and ransom. Those are the root metaphors behind which is the fundamental view of what the atonement is. And a price is paid for our release, restitution is given for that release, amends is made for our wrongdoing. That's what the atonement does. And unless that amends is made, reconciliation between you and God does not ensue. Being declared righteous in God's eyes does not ensue. Having victory over the spiritual powers does not ensue. In fact, the great text about the victory of spiritual powers in Colossians 2 says that that occurs only because Christ on the cross is equivalent to posting on the cross, IOU paid. And it's only because Christ's death pays for the debt of our sin to God that we then have victory over the powers. This is, by the way, a big mistake in large pockets of the Orthodox Church, Orthodox Big O Church, is that they, not in the earliest stages, as John Chrysostom, an Eastern Church father, is very big on that understanding of atonement. But over the centuries, that's been reduced because they're reacting against the Western Christian faith, against Rome, which emphasizes this judicial dimension of making amends or restitution. But you can't, and so they elevate instead, no, atonement is victory over the powers. Wrong, thanks for playing, but no, something accomplishes the victory over the powers. So that's what you have to explain, which I just tried to do. And here we could see it coming into full expression in these stories about the martyrs during the time of Antiochus IV. So this is moving from the literal animal sacrifice to the martyrdom of human beings accomplishing this as well. So then begins the Maccabean revolt in 167 BC. From the moment in Chislev 25, 167, when Antiochus has that offering of swine on the altar, a burnt offering, the abomination of desolation, and then its after effects. And it begins in a little town called Modaim, which is 17 miles northwest of Jerusalem. We'll come back to Maccabee in a moment. But Mattathias is a priest there, an Aaronite, not Zadokite, but Aaronite priest. The king's officer comes to that town and he tells Matthias to offer a pagan sacrifice on an altar that he just built. So now is the test. Mattathias refuses to do so, but another Jew steps forward to do it in his place. The text then says that Mattathias burned with zeal for the law, just as Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, had done during the apostasy of Baal Peor with the Midianites. Remember what he did? He entered a temple in which a noble from the Israelites and a noble from the Midianites, a female, entered a temple and may have even been engaging in a fertility rite, trying to stimulate Baal to bring crops and to get rid of that particular problem, to get rid of the disease that God had plagued the people with for their sins. And what does Phinehas do? He goes into the tent and does what? Spears them right while in mid-act. That's an example of zeal, being willing to kill fellow Jews if need be who are committing apostasy. This also happens in the case of Elijah at the Mount Carmel episode with the Baal prophets who are Jewish. He slaughters them. That's an example of zeal. And now we have an example for Mattathias. Slaying this Israelite, this Jew is about to offer a sacrifice to a pagan deity. That's zeal for the law. Who else do we know about for that phrase, zeal for the law, in the New Testament? Paul. Paul recalls that. We once tried to destroy the church. That is, he was willing to kill fellow Jews who he believes were committing apostasy in relation to the law of Moses. Of course, he found himself on the wrong side of Jesus Christ at that point. And he also kills the king's officer. He tears down the altar, and then he cried out, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law come out with me." And then he and his 5 sons fled to the hills to begin a guerrilla warfare against Antiochus's forces, Greek forces. Other resistance fighters joined them, including a group known as the Hasidim, the pious ones, possibly zealous scribes, lay experts in the law, not priests, although maybe some priests were included. Later on, 5 years later, the new Seleucid king, Lysias, will rescind the decree outlawing Judaism, and the Hasidim will then quit the revolt. No need to continue. But the descendants of Mattathias continue. A decade after that, the Hasidim completely break with the Maccabees, the descendants of Mattathias, when Jonathan, youngest of Mattathias' sons, is appointed high priest by the Seleucid ruler. But while an Aaronite, he's not a Zadokite, so he shouldn't have taken the job. The Hasidim are very pious about that, and they cut ties with them completely. And the Essenes and the Pharisees are probably formed from the ranks, scholars believe, from this enigmatic group called the Hasidim. Judah, or Judas, Judah, Yehuda in Hebrew, Judas in Greek. Then, with the death of his father, Mattathias dies a natural death, takes over the leadership of the revolt. He's given the epithet or nickname Maccabee in Hebrew, or Maccabeus in Greek, which means hammer, and it's a reference to his military prowess. He then wins a series of battles, and that leads to the recapture of the temple precincts, and a rededication of the temple. On Chislev 25th, 164 BC, 3 years to the day after it had been defiled by Antiochus IV. Hereafter celebrated as Hanukkah, which means rededication. When they arrived at the temple precincts, they could see that the sanctuary was desolate, the altar had been profaned, the gates had been burned, wild bushes had sprung up, and the chambers of the priests were in ruins. Jerusalem was uninhabited like a wilderness, hence the abomination of desolation terminology. The sanctuary was trampled down, and aliens, Gentiles, held the citadel, which was a fortress located south of the Temple Mount, which was still being occupied at this time by soldiers of Antiochus IV, Greeks. They tore their clothes and they mourned to see what had happened to the temple. Judas then detailed men to fight against those in the fortress, Acra, citadel we just talked about, with high walls and a tower in the city of David in Jerusalem, south of the Temple Mount. It had been constructed 3 years earlier by Antiochus IV so that he could keep watch and guard over the temple precincts. He stationed a Macedonian garrison there. And it was also a place in which apostate Jews could flee if zealot, faithful Jews attempted to kill them. And in 2015, archaeologists actually discovered a section of the wall of the tower of the Acra, that citadel, along with some arrowheads from the Macedonian garrison there, with a symbol of a trident, which was a symbol for Antiochus IV's reign. So Judas then cleansed the sanctuary. Who would cleanse the temple at a later time? And Jesus would cleanse the temple, but now for different reasons. So Judas, by the way, note the name, Judas, Yehuda, though he's a good one, but there will be a later one, not so good. He tore down, he cleansed the sanctuary by tearing down the stones of that defiled altar of burnt, the whole altar of burnt offering had to be torn down because it was defiled. And the text says, interestingly enough, that they stored the stones in a convenient place on the Temple Hill until a prophet should come to tell them what to do with it. The writer then comments that the prophets had long since ceased to appear in Israel. And even as late as 140 BC, after this, 25 years after this, the people, the text says, were still waiting for a trustworthy prophet to come. Of course, he would come in the person of Jesus, eventually. And they built a new altar of burnt offering, and they rebuilt the sanctuary proper and the interior of the temple, and they consecrated the courts, and they made holy vessels. And they brought into the temple the lampstand, the menorah, the altar of incense, and the table of showbread into the temple, that is, into the holy place of the temple. Nothing is said about bringing the Ark of the Covenant into the Holy of Holies. A nice little note you read in Strauss here, where he explains why at this point in the time they no longer had the Ark. But there was a small stone in the Holy of Holies in its place. Then they set each of these three items of the holy place into operation. They offered incense on the incense altar, not the outside altar, the incense altar. They lit the 7 lamps of the menorah to give light in the temple, and they placed the bread on the table of showbread. And they hung up the curtains. These, by the way, are the earliest images that we have of a menorah. Some images on the coins here. Also here, a stone that was found in a place called Magdala, the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, dating no later than the 1st century AD. Also, this plaster we see here on the right from the Herodian period, from homes in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem. We see an image they fill out in reconstruction what the rest of the image would be. Okay, let's see the elements, the 7 branches of the menorah. Here's what the menorah looked like in the Herodian temple later, when Herod built the temple, reconstructed the temple, made it this great wonder of the world. Much larger menorah we see here. This is a relief from the Arch of Titus in Rome, 80 AD. After the temple had been destroyed, they carried out the menorah and brought it back with them in Rome to parade it as one of the booty that they acquired. And they celebrated on the 25th day. They offered sacrifice on the new altar of burnt offering. They sang songs, they played harps, lutes, cymbals. All the people fell on their faces and worship. This is a common practice. By the way, you've seen this probably in the book of Revelation. What do the elders do? When the song is sung to the Lamb and to the Ancient of Days, they do what? They fall on their faces. Try it sometime in worship. Don't care what anyone else thinks. Complete prostration before the one who has given all for us, who laid down his life for us. It's a small thing for us to fall on our faces. In worship, complete obeisance to this one, the great Savior of all. And they celebrated the dedication of the altar. How many days? 8 days. How many days did it take Solomon to dedicate the temple? 8. How many days did it take Hezekiah to purify the temple from his father's idolatrous defilement of it? 8. So they did 8 here. 8 days of celebration at the rededication of the temple. They carried ivy wreathed wands and beautiful branches and fronds of palm, and they offered hymns of thanksgiving. When Jesus was entering the temple at the end of his ministry, what would become the end of his ministry, and he's riding in on a donkey. And what are the people doing? They have palm branches they're laying out in front of him. Palm branches are a symbol of victory, God's victory. And it's a reminder of what they did when the temple was rededicated. But ironically, Jesus goes into the temple not to celebrate its dedication, its rededication, a century and a half, 180 years before. Or to do what? Cleanse it again. And all this is recalling this event, but somewhat in obverse. I think so. I have to remember, I did a whole long Facebook note about that one point in time. I have to remind myself about that. I'll send it all to you. I'll send it in a note. So Judas determines that every year the days of dedication of the altar should be observed with joy and gladness for 8 days, beginning on the 25th day of Chislev. They fortified Mount Zion with high walls and strong towers to keep the Gentiles in the Acra or citadel away from attacking the temple area. They stationed a garrison there to guard it. It's not until much later that we read about a tradition of the miracle about the oil that would come to be a central piece of Hanukkah celebration in later centuries. Even Josephus in the 1st century, despite calling this festival the Festival of Lights, does not explain it with this legend. This legend is a later legend that takes place, where they only had enough oil to light one lamp of the menorah. But through some great miracle, they got enough, not just for a single day, but for all 8 days. It never ran out. And other stuff here about Hanukkah. We're going to move on from that. Now, Antiochus IV dies in 164 BC, late 164, so right around the time of the rededication of the temple, of some illness that he gets when he's trying to rob another temple in his territory. Conflict continues on and off for the next 23 years between Zealot Jewish forces and the Seleucid Empire. As we noted earlier, the decrees banning Judaism are rescinded by King Lysias in 162. As we noted, many of the Jews, including the Hasidim, then quit the revolt, but the Hasmoneans fought on. Hasmoneans is another way of referring to the Maccabees. Maccabee, remember, is an epithet given to Judas because of his military prowess. It means hammer. And during that time, while the fighting is still going on, it's referred to the Maccabean revolt. But the family, especially during the dynastic reign, can be called Hasmoneans as well, because the ancestor, great-grandfather of Mattathias' name was Hasmonai, hence Hasmoneans. So when they call them the Maccabees, Hasmoneans, you're talking about Mattathias and his sons who led the revolt and then set up a dynasty with Jewish independence. Judas is killed in battle in 160, battle with the Syrian army. There's then political turmoil in Syria for over a decade that aids the Maccabees to consolidate their gains in Palestine. Jonathan, the youngest of the sons of Mattathias, is appointed high priest by the Seleucid ruler in 152 BC, but then he's treacherously slain 9 years later. Now, this takeover of the office of the high priest by the Hasmoneans, as we noted, further alienates the pious ones, the Hasidim, because while Aaronite, they're not Zadokite. They shouldn't be occupying the high priest office. And this precipitates the development of the Essenes and the Pharisees. Finally, under Simon, Shimon, the second oldest of Mattathias' sons, he obtains complete independence for Israel in 141 BC, and he became high priest, leader of the people, ethnarch, and commander, strategos, of the army. He can do it all, apparently. He engineers the expulsion of the Gentile Macedonian soldiers from the citadel, south of the Temple Mount. Jews then enter the citadel with praise and palm branches again, because this completes the rededication of the temple precincts, getting rid of the occupation by pagan forces in the citadel south of the Temple Mount. A great enemy had been crushed and removed from Israel. Simon himself is assassinated in 134 BC, succeeded by his son John Hyrcanus, Yochanan Hyrcanus. A generation later, in 104, Aristobulus I, who's the eldest son of Hyrcanus, he rules only a year, then dies. He, in that short time, replaced the title ethnarch, leader, ruler of the people or the nation, and took the grander title of basileus, Greek word for king. So now, in effect, they're both high priest and king at one and the same time. Big problem. They're not of Zadokite descent, although Aaronite, and they're not of Davidic descent. So they're taking prerogatives they shouldn't be taking. Alexander Eunaeus, half-brother of Aristobulus, reigns for a few decades. He acts like a despot. He's supported by the Sadducees, the aristocrats. He crucifies hundreds of Pharisees during his reign, because there's debate between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We'll talk about that more next time. Alexandra succeeds him when he dies. She becomes a fan of the Pharisees, and now they get the revenge against the Sadducees. After her reign, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, two sons of hers, then vie for the throne. They can't settle it. One of them invites the Roman general Pompey in to settle it for them. He then does that, but that also brings Israel under Roman rule. And that's the end of Jewish independence under the Hasmonean dynasty. He appoints just one as high priest. Here's a genealogy if you want to study that later. Now, there were accomplishments of the dynasty. They conquered the rest of Judea, Idumea, former Edom, land south. They conquered Samaria in the middle. They conquered Galilee up north. So they're consolidating older boundaries of the land of Israel and a significant part of the Transjordan and the former territories of the Philistines. So that's one good thing that they did. Sometimes they would insist on forced conversion, as they did with the Idumeans or Edomites. You will become Jews, we're not asking you, or you die. Sometimes they drove out the pagans completely out of the territories. Sometimes they just slaughtered them. The power and prestige of Jerusalem and the temple increases at this point. Jerusalem undergoes a fivefold increase in population and size. The temple precincts become a center now for politics, the courts, for commerce, the temple market, and other life, religious life beyond the temple. Sects meet there. First fruits, tithes, personal sacrificial offerings, sin, guilt, vow offerings, and attendance at great festivals all now become a more central part of Jewish life. It had been in the wane for a long time. Initially, Rome reinstalls Hyrcanus II, a Maccabean, a Hasmonean, but only as high priest. In 55, rule then passes to an Idumean or Edomite by the name of Antipater. He is the father of Herod the Great. Now, remember, the Idumeans have been forced to convert to Judaism a half century before. Antipater had gained, as governor, special privileges for Jews in the Roman Empire, exempting them from military service and a right to gather. Antipater was soon assassinated. His son went to Rome. He was given authorization to replace his father as ruler if he could go back and recapture the territory, which he did. He recaptured Jerusalem with Roman support in 37 BC. He then became Herod the Great, Herodes, over the whole of Israel, Judea, including Idumea or Edom, Samaria, Galilee, and he ruled like a dictator. He was a megalomaniac, and he was vicious. What you read about him in Matthew 2 exactly fits the profile of what we know about Herod. His Jewish ancestry was, to put it mildly, complicated. It was a sensitive subject for him, and it became a source of criticism directed towards him by others who did not appreciate his rule. He was raised as a Jew by his father, Antipater, but his father was ethnically Idumean or Edomite. On his mother's side, Antipater had married a woman who was Arab, a Nabatean princess. You can see shaded here in the map, the Nabatean kingdom, south and southeast of Israel. It's an Arabian kingdom. A Greek geographer by the name of Strabo believed that the Idumeans were actually not of Edomite origin, but were actually of Nabatean origin, Arab origin. And if that were true, then Herod would be completely Arab. Josephus, a first century Jewish historian, discounts a claim made by a court historian of Herod, Nicolaus of Damascus. Nicolaus had claimed that Antipater's family had belonged to the Jews who came to Judea from Babylon in the return from exile. But Josephus says that's a bunch of propaganda. It's not true. The Hasmonean Antigonus, who obviously is resentful of what Herod has done to the Hasmonean rule, argued that he was nothing but a commoner and an Idumean, that is a half Jew. And that's generally how he was viewed, at best, as a half Jew. I'm going to stop there and ask if you have any questions or comments. We'll start first with those taking it for credit. Yeah, I might actually go into Daniel. I think I'm going to go a little bit into Daniel in the next part. So we'll table that question for a moment, but it's a great question. Okay, open up to everybody in the room. Yes? You are going to get everything that we just done has been recorded. So I will put that on YouTube, and then it'll be a private link, so don't share it with anybody else. Okay. I'm gonna email you the link, and then you can just go and you can replay it at your, as you're reclining at table and eating your grapes, you can turn this on. Yes.
So we'll get these notes. What we see here is what we'll get.
All, that's right. You're going to get what has been recorded as the PowerPoint.
Okay.
So I'm thinking, just a comment, the uphill struggle that Paul had in trying to convince the Jews, it's Gentiles, following.
Yeah, it's a very big law because this was deep. This was deeply the Maccabean revolt was, and the prior persecution by Antiochus IV was deeply embedded in the psyche of every Jew by the first century. I mean, again, a whole book, Fourth Maccabees, is being written in this period, just about a few of the martyrs. And the literature, the Maccabean literature and other literature all points to this. This is the focus of everything. Now you have a Jew who we thought was a Pharisee and zealous for the oral traditions, which the Pharisees are, not just for the written law, but for the oral law that tells us how to apply the written law in changing circumstances in Pharisaic tradition. All that's being given up to reach out to these Gentiles. He has become an apostate. There's no other way to look at it.
Maybe that's one of the reasons why he went to Jerusalem to talk to Peter, to get his buy-in.
Well, Paul is very careful about that. He talks about that in Galatians 1 and 2. And he's very careful to say that he did not go to Jerusalem to Peter or James or anybody else to get from them his gospel. He got that from Jesus directly. But he was happy to see that the gospel they were preaching was the same gospel. That was good. But he wants to make very clear that his gospel is not dependent on them if they should depart from it. They are not the authors of the gospel. But yeah, there was a concern, and why he eventually went to Jerusalem with the collection is to make sure that his churches in Europe would be connected with the mother church in Jerusalem, and that this would be a reflection of the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, where the nations would stream into Jerusalem with their gifts. And in a little way, Paul's doing that with his ministry. Here's a collection from the Gentile churches, from the nations, in fulfillment of the prophecies of old. Yes. Yeah, the question, I have to remember to restate the questions. I think I forgot that earlier. So the question is, am I relying on books that books of the Maccabees that we don't find trustworthy because they're not in our scripture? We are relying in part on 1st, 2nd Maccabee, 4th Maccabees. We're relying also on Josephus. And certainly when they're telling the same story, it's likely to be historically true. So the fact that we don't consider them, we consider them as part of the Apocrypha, and Protestant churches don't put the Apocrypha as having the same canonical status. They do have canonical status in the Catholic Church and in the Orthodox Church. They're called deuterocanonical, second canonical, not because they're secondary in those churches, but rather because they're late. They're just later books, but still fully canonical. The Protestant Reformation doesn't agree with that for various reasons. But nevertheless, they can be used as sources of history of what happened during this period of time. We have nothing else to appeal to. You had a second question? Okay. Okay. We're now at a point in time, I probably should have said 10 minutes earlier, but this is the time when those who need to leave to pick up any children and so forth can do that. I am not, however, requiring anybody to leave who is a surveyor. If you want to stay, you can stay. If you want to go and you've made other commitments, I won't be offended. It's entirely your choice. So I'm going to break now for 5 minutes and we'll sort it out. And those of you who are taking for credit, you stay. You have to stay. You want to stay. And of course, everyone else is welcome to stay who wants to stay. Okay? Yes. Well, we're going to talk about the book of Daniel, 7 to 12, and we're going to talk a little bit about Herod the Great and things like that. However much we can get done in that time period. 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock. You could say part of the time and go part of the time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we're all set.
When
so-
you're done.
Yeah, they are selling the textbook. For those of you who might want the textbook, they are selling the textbook at HBU bookstore. But you can also get it, of course, at Amazon.
Yeah. When I pull in there, just I do a few bookstore. I've never been a job by Sloan's still there. Yeah. So when I go into the building, is it to the right? When I go in there, will it say, will it come in like where I'm walking the bookstore?
Well, check this out.
I'm coming off of 59.
If I'm getting the right location, we're coming in the parking lot. Hard to describe. Parking lot, you should be able to. I think.
Well, Ryan always thinks that little entrance, you know, you have the little kind of platform there and a little, the monument that says the name of the university with 2 lanes, 1 in and 1 out. Right, strip centers on both sides. Is there a better way I should go in? Well, you're right. I'll figure it out. All right, I'll figure it out. Okay, all right, yeah.
But if you go there, any stop.
Just ask anybody else if
Everyone.
it's kind of small area. Right. Okay. Thank you.
Let's see.
rather than simply God himself.
I didn't get all of that. Say that again.
Why is the temple originally built referring to a place for God's name rather than God himself?
Well, because there's a desire to preserve God's transcendence. And even when Solomon builds the temple, the Solomonic temple, Great Solomonic temple, the first temple, he makes clear that, you know, God is bigger than the temple. God resides beyond the temple, but he places his being here, his name, as a way of talking about a sort of hypostatic presence of God in the temple, with God still being out there, but nevertheless present here imminently among his people, but not his fullness, not everything that God is.
Mhm.
Does that answer your question?
I'll have to think about it, but it's a very good answer. I'm just not sure I
Okay.
comprehended it yet. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else?
Doctor, if you can hear me, when you were talking about the abomination, desolation, and Mark, you mentioned that it kind of implies that the Jews are fighting with each other. Could you just confirm that and what you meant by that?
That's right. The zealot forces who have initiated the revolt against Rome because of a lot of incompetence, insensitivity by Roman rulers, sacrilege. Finally, they had enough. They revolted, but there wasn't a uniform zealot leadership. There were competing groups developing in different areas. And then they competed with each other as to who should be in charge of the whole operation. And two or more sets of groups occupied the Temple Mount in the court of the Gentiles and fought with each other over who will have preeminence.
Okay, thank you.
And thereby defiling the temple with their bloodshed. So obviously not a good thing. That's a different kind of defilement than the defilement that took place in the case of Antiochus.
Right.
Now, let me put this up this way. 1 second. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. That may not work, but we'll try it. But that is what Christians view as the results of sin in Israel, and the Romans are thought of as being God's agent of judgment against Israel for their rejection of the gospel, the rejection of Jesus, killing of Jesus, and the rejection of his messengers. Okay, we're going to move on now to Daniel. And my view is that Daniel, not just my view, it's a standard view of Daniel, the second half, 7 to 12, is written later than the material in chapters 1 to 6. And it consists of 4 visions, really big one in chapters 10 to 12, plus a large vision in 7, smaller vision in 8, and in 9. And these are each visions of world history to, according to the text, the time of the end or the end of days. And all the visions appear to point to the time of Antiochus IV. That's how they most easily read. Now, then they are reinterpreted in subsequent years when there's ongoing events that take place. That is that the events that we're talking about here refer to events in 167 to 165, culminating in the prohibition of Judaism. And these visions all contain what we would call apocalyptic features. Apocalypse means a revelation. Apocalyptic literature is a revelation usually about the end times. It's usually a revelation about the world above and the age to come. We normally think of it on the temporal vector with the age to come. Will there be an end to this world order and a new world order arising out of it through divine intervention? Sometimes that intervention is direct. Usually it's, in any case, more direct than what we find in classical prophecy of the Hebrew Bible, where God uses human agents. Here, there's more of a supernatural dimension to it. And there is a judgment of the wicked and a resurrection of the righteous. There is lots of symbolism in apocalyptic visions, dream visions that usually require interpretation by a supernatural being, an angel. There are cosmic and mythic dimensions to the vision. That is, the scope of the actions taken in the visions involves the whole world, and sometimes even includes beyond the world to the heavens, the stars, and the planets. The realities that are presented therein are transcendent, and they often draw on old, ancient mythic imagery and refurbish it for new circumstances, even ancient Canaanite mythology, as we'll see. The view of history that they have is usually deterministic. It's all divinely foreordained. History is thought of as having various periods of time, leading to an overall presentation of God being in control. Sometimes we find even ex eventu prophecy after the fact. That's a more debatable point. And in early Judaism, a number of works are pseudepigraphal that come under the rubric of apocalyptic works in early Judaism. I'm not talking about canonical works here, but non-canonical early Jewish works. In the book of Daniel, it may be that Daniel is being used as a rubric for the real historical transmitters of these visions, who refer to themselves in the text as the masculine. which means those who are wise. They don't seem to be taking up arms with the Maccabees in revolt against Judaism, but they are nonviolent activists. They do want to see Antiochus defeated, but their job is to enable the righteous to endure by sharing insight into the mysteries of God's plan for the world. Yes. Daniel, all from the book of Daniel. God's plan, according to them, is to deliver the many, chapter 11 and 12, by intervention, divine intervention, through Israel's patron angel, Michael, who is specifically mentioned in chapter 12 and also mentioned in chapter 11. He, by the way, also appears frequently in material from Qumran, which we trace to a sectarian group called the Essenes. These are the Dead Sea Scrolls, you may have heard about, discovered shortly after World War II in caves on the southwestern coast of the Dead Sea. And they also appeal to great heavenly battles involving the Archangel Michael, chief angel and patron angel of Israel, against Belial, Satan, and his forces that involve a heavenly dimension and an earthly dimension. We see this in the book of Revelation. There's a two-tiered dimension. Victory will ultimately come on earth because of victory that transpires in the heavenly realms. And the great victory occurs when the Lamb and the forces of Michael, the archangel, throw out Satan from the heavenly realms onto earth, which then precipitates a crisis on earth, but which ultimately has already been predetermined by the victory of the Lamb in heaven. And it may be that the masculine, the wise ones, who are preserving these visions, are modeling themselves after the suffering servant in Isaiah. So think about Daniel 12:3, the masculine, those who make righteous the many will shine like the stars forever. That will be their reward for their faithfulness. Compare that with Isaiah 53:11 about the suffering servant. The righteous one, my servant, will make righteous the many. Or Daniel 12:2, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake. Compare with Isaiah 26:19. Your dead shall arise, O dwellers in the dust, awake. The earth shall give birth to the shades. Now the situation, they say, looks hopeless. Looks hopeless at the present time with the struggle with Antiochus. But since the struggle, the ultimate determination of this is taking place in heaven between the patron angels of the respective nations, then ultimately the battle is already won. And with that, they encourage the military arm of the Maccabees. Now, in Daniel 7, which is one of the two most important of the visions in 7 and 12, we have a dream of one like a son of man. This is big reason why I'm taking time out to do this, is not only its correlation with the Maccabean revolt, but also the significance of the title Son of Man for Jesus in the four Gospels. So there is a dream of four great beasts that are coming out of the great sea in succession. One looks like a lion, representing Babylon, as we find out later. Another looks like a bear, representing the kingdom of the Medes. A third, a leopard, representing the kingdom of Persia. And the fourth and final beast, representing Greece, Alexander. had 10 horns, and then an 11th horn appeared, a little one. Scholars think refers to Antiochus IV, a little horn from the Greek kingdom that emanated from Alexander the Great ultimately. And it spoke arrogantly. Now, this is all very important because these images are also going to be refurbished in the book of Revelation. We're discussing a new tyrant, a Roman ruler. Anyone know who the likely figure is? No, that's a good guess though. Nero is part of the whole vision, and Nero Redivivus come back to life again, but Domitian before that. But it might the ultimate climax might be with the Nero come back to life. That's a good one. Then, after he sees the beast rising out of the sea and the little horn on the fourth beast, he sees a new scene. He sees the Ancient of Days taking his seat, his throne, in his throne room. He has clothing white as snow, and the hair of his head is like pure wool. Everything about and around him is fire. Throne, the wheels, and what was flowing from his presence. Fire, of course, very strongly associated with Yahweh, the Sinai theophany. Around him and other episodes are 100 million angelic attendants. Court then sat in judgment, and the books were opened. The fate of the little horn is sealed. Think of the seals in the book of Revelation. Because these books are the heavenly books of destiny. And when they open, it indicates that the times that must now come to pass before the end will ensue. All in God's plan. In that, the fourth beast was put to death, and his dominion was taken away from him and the other three beasts. Most importantly, Daniel then sees also one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He's coming to the Ancient of Days. Now, it's not stated explicitly, but it seems to be presumed in the context. Why is he coming before the Ancient of Days? He's coming before the Ancient of Days because he's being invested with authority over all things because of his defeat of the chaos beast coming out of the sea and the arrogant little horn. In fact, the text says, in fact, that he was given an everlasting dominion, indestructible kingship, so that all peoples, nations, and languages shall serve him. Getting an inkling of what Jesus is saying when he refers to himself as the Son of Man. It's a double entendre. It's a dual meaning. Son of Man is a Hebraism for a human being. But in this dream symbolism, the one that looks like a human being is an exalted divine figure. And this is typical of Jewish dream symbolism of the period. For example, in the books of Enoch. Life forms are illustrated in dream symbolism with lower life forms. Human kingdoms are illustrated by, in this dream, beasts, animals. So if animals symbols equal humans, a higher life form, one looking like a human being is probably a divine being. That's the way it operates. So Daniel asks an angelic attendant for an interpretation. It's typical of apocalyptic literature. Says the four beasts are four kings, really four kingdoms, with the fourth being a fourth kingdom that will devour the whole earth, out of which kingdom 10 kings will arise, and another after them, who shall be different from the former ones. That's the little horn. That arrogant little horn will speak words against the Most High, namely God. That's an epithet for Yahweh. He will attempt to change the law. We mean what law there? The law of Moses. And make war against the holy ones of the Most High, with the holy ones given into his power for 3.5 years, a time, 2 times, and half a time. Then when the Ancient of Days comes, the court will sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away, and the holy ones shall receive the kingdom forever, and all dominions shall serve them. That is the people of God. Now, in this text, the meaning of holy ones, as in Jewish literature generally, oscillates between angels on the one hand and the righteous Jews that these angels represent on the other hand. Though sometimes the distinction can be made, as in verse 27, the people, i.e. righteous Jews, of the holy ones, i.e. the angels of the Most High. The battle that takes place in the heavenly realm, as we noted earlier, determines the outcome of the battle that takes place on earth between an evil earthly king and God's people. That there is a battle between heavenly forces is suggested by texts in chapter 10, which refer to the angels, Michael and Gabriel, against the angelic princes of the kingdoms of Media, Persia, and Greece. Patron angels of these earthly kingdoms are doing battle here in the heavenly realms. Now, this is not entirely new to any Jew who hears this. In the time of these visions, they would recognize this imagery because this imagery is appropriated throughout the period of ancient Israel's rise, and even before that, in Canaanite myth. It's actually reminiscent of Baal's defeat of the chaos sea dragon, Yam. We have this in Canaanite myth, found at Ugarit, Rosh Hashanah, in Phoenician territory, from around 2000 BC, or maybe that's a little late, about 1500 BC. And in that story, which is a cosmogony, it's about the creation of the world. Baal Hadad is a storm god. What has happened is Yam, sea, the word for sea, sends messengers to the divine council of El, God, and he says, hand over Baal Hadad to us, Prince Baal. The high judge is El, God, the Ancient of Days. And El says, you got him. So they bring him back to chaotic sea. But Baal goes with magic clubs fashioned for him by Kothar in the Divine Assembly, and he clubs to death Yam Sea, and he returns and appears in great theophany, thunder and lightning, because he's a storm god. And that's how he visibly manifests his reign. Baal now rules. Why does he rule? Because he defeats chaotic sea waters, illustrated often by the image of a dragon and other alternate images of Canaanite myth. And in fact, we even find in scripture, God's dealing is defeat of Egypt at the sea, and a judge river in the Jordan is also imaged as a defeat of chaotic sea imaged as a dragon, Rahab, Leviathan. So we see this kind of imagery being appropriated by Israel, only now there's just one God, Yahweh, who is at once the judge and head of the divine council and also the storm god. He's everything. The appearance of the aged El at the council of gods again is in the story, and then Baal returns. He's a rider on clouds. He returns to El at the Mount of Assembly to receive kingship. When Jesus comes to earth in his return, he's going to come on what? The clouds of heaven. That's storm god imagery. Refurbished, applied to what it really refers to, in effect, Israel is saying, or Christians are saying. The successive world empires culminate in the Little Horn, which is the Seleucid tyrant Antiochus IV, arising out of the fourth beast. He speaks against God. He attempts to change the law, i.e. abolish it. He makes war on the holy ones. All that refers to his defiling of the temple altar, his outlawing of Judaism, his persecuting of non-Hellenizing faithful Jews. The one like a son of man, then, must be the only other angelic figure referred to as the patron angel of Israel, which is Michael, which literally means who is like El, who is like God. No one. That's the only other figure that this veiled illusion could be referring to in the historical context of the Daniel 7 to 12, I would argue. Again, by the way, like anything I say here, you don't have to agree with anything I say here. Don't ever agree with anything I say here if you think that what I'm saying is not right. Only if you're convinced by the presentation I'm giving. If you're not convinced, then say, forget it. Gagnon is up a creek without a paddle. I'm not going to accept that. Okay? But I'm just telling you how I've looked at it after decades of thinking about it and what I'm going to do with it, trying to make sense of the text in its literary and historical context, but it doesn't mean that I'm right simply because I do it. If anyone ever wants to say, you've got to believe what I say, then I say, give me the arguments. Because if I don't find the arguments convincing, I don't care who you are. Even the Christians at Berea searched the scriptures when Paul came to them to see whether it was so. And if they could do that with Paul, you should certainly do that with me. Search the scriptures, okay? Again, terrifying beasts symbolize the human kingdoms, human-like figures symbolize angels. We have this Son of Man idiom, Hebrew idiom for human beings. He's like a human, not a human, but he's like a human in dream symbolism. He looks more like a human than he looks like one of the horrifying beasts. Therefore, he's a higher life form than human authorities. And in fact, angels in Daniel have a human-like appearance. Chapters 8, 9, and 10.
So are you saying that the verse that talks about appearing before the ancient of days, you're saying that particular verse in that context?
I'm probably in the context of those writing this text at that time. Now, we also talk about in scripture progressive revelation. So there can be a connection between this event A and event B, but then it's not, the prophecy isn't fully realized. It's partially realized, and its fulfillment will occur at another time, of which this event is a foreshadowing. So we also have that happening a lot with prophecy. There's an initial fulfillment, but it's not the consummated fulfillment. So that's another way of viewing it, in which both can be correct. Well, there's the question is Israel copying what it's getting from the surrounding environment? And to an extent, they are taking up that imagery, because it's like any time in the church, a good pastor will sometimes take up imagery that appears outside the Christian church, but in a sense, baptize it and use it for Christian purposes as a metaphor or anything else. So a reigning view in the ancient Near East had to do with cosmogony. How is the world created? And whether you look at Babylon, or you look at Sumer, or you look at Canaan, then you have a basic image of a storm god figure who defeats the forces of chaos, usually imaged as uncontrollable raging sea, which is further imaged in the figure of a dragon, sometimes multiply headed. So again, when you see the image of Satan in Revelation, it's the image of a dragon with 7 heads. Now, they didn't just make that up out of whole cloth. That's a standard image for chaos and evil in the ancient world. So it's not at all surprising they use that as an image for talking about Satan. Yeah, it's Yahweh taking images. That's my conclusion, but probably you would agree with that, but I'm assuming, but that's how I look at it. And knowledge isn't restricted only to the people of God. There's knowledge that occurs outside the people of God. And ancient Israel, early Judaism, early Christianity grow up in larger environments. And they speak in the language of what exists in their environment. Yeah, exactly. But they're obviously changing it in significant ways, right? Like when you look at Genesis 1, when you look at the cosmogony in Genesis 1, you still, instead of having an opening theogony, that is the birth of the gods, which usually begins these stories, we have pairs like night and day. Now they appear in Genesis, but they're no longer animate forces, olden gods. They're rather inanimate matter. And there's no longer God fighting another God in what we call a theomarchy, a fight or battle between the gods. But God is in complete control over everything. And in the ancient Near Eastern cosmogonies, there's something that exists before the gods come into existence. What we might refer to as a meta-divine realm. That is a realm that's higher than the realm of the divinities, the gods, that makes the gods insecure. But when you go and look at Genesis 1, there is no such realm. God is without beginning. So you see Israel taking images that exist in the ancient Near Eastern environment, but radically changing them. Say again.
The part about received an everlasting
The everlasting dominion, how's that play into the figure of Michael? It's just that Michael is the only other figure mentioned that could fit that bill. If we're looking within the context of the book of Daniel. Now we could say, somebody could say, well, it's not Michael, we know it's Jesus because Jesus referred to himself as the Son of Man.
Did they ever consider Michael as having dominion?
But they did, and that we see in the Dead Sea Scroll text from the 1st, 2nd century BC, where Michael is the patron angel leader in the heavenly realm over the faithful Israelites in the earthly realm, battling Satan and the human forces of evil. And that's drawn from Daniel. That's how they've interpreted it. So it's confirmation for the fact. You sort of have to ask, what would the initial hearers of these visions in ancient Israel have heard? And based on the text, it's likely that they would have drawn on Michael as being. So we have here what we call a two-level apocalyptic drama that's behind what seems to be just mundane events, earthly events. The victory of Israel's patron angel determines the victory of the people of God on earth. Two-level drama. Now, divine intervention through Michael will result in Antiochus' death 3.5 years later. That's what it's saying. And a kingdom of Israel will then come about that will rule all the nations of the earth. As we noted just a moment ago, the Dead Sea Scrolls depict exactly that. A final battle between Michael and Belial, Satan. The book of Revelation in the New Testament reapplies the image of the beast to Rome. That's the new empire, the new great threat, which persecutes Christians because they refuse to worship the emperor in emperor worship. And the minion, Rome, is simply the minion of the dragon, Satan. So much for the Pax Romana of Augustus. He's really just an agent of Satan. And Rome's defeat then is predetermined by the throwing down of Satan from heaven, as we alluded to earlier. Later use of the Son of Man in Christian and Jewish tradition. So the Synoptic Gospels, as we noted, Jesus appropriates that imagery for himself. It both describes the authority he has on earth, and it also describes what he's going to do when he returns from heaven, coming with the clouds of heaven. Only it's in the opposite direction.
So did the first century Jews see Jesus as claim to that as saying, I'm Michael, or did they say it as saying I'm God?
I think they would probably say Jesus is the highest fulfillment of who the one like a Son of Man is. There's a Michael doing a sort of role beforehand in the Maccabean revolt, but yeah, it's not the ultimate resolution. That's how they probably view it. And we could probably assume that Jesus is coming before the clouds of heaven to before the Ancient of Days. God is his enthronement after his resurrection and ascension to be at the right hand of God. But then he's going to come back to earth on those very same clouds of heaven to now inaugurate God's reign on earth. Okay, now I can see my time is sort of running out. So I've now reached the point, and you'll see this in class after class, where I'm just cutting my losses and moving forward. Okay, and if you have additional questions after 9, I'll be happy to stay for as long as anyone wants to ask questions. Okay, but there's some critical stuff here I want to get out. And there's some changes. So instead of with the clouds in Daniel 7 and talking about Jesus, it's on the clouds. There's a double entendre use here, likely. Jesus is referring again to himself as both the exalted Son of Man in Daniel 7, but also as a representative human among humans, which is why he can make amends for the sins of the world. The Gospel of John, unlike the Synoptic Gospels, connects the use of the Son of Man terminology directly with Jesus' descent from heaven. There's no such language like that in the Synoptic Gospels. When I mean Synoptic Gospels, I mean Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke never refer to Jesus coming down from heaven. Jesus never has a statement. We'll talk about that later, why that is. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke's gospel does not, Jesus never makes a statement about coming down from heaven. In John's gospel, he does it all over the place. And he does it in connection with referring to the Son of Man. And that's quite appropriate for this imagery, given what's going on in Daniel 7. Now, this figure of an apocalyptic Son of Man isn't just limited to Christians. It also appears in 2 other Jewish works, the parables of Enoch and 4th Ezra, which are both late 1st century works. So although Son of Man doesn't start out as a title in Daniel 7, note the full language one looking like a Son of Man, it does become a convenient shorthand at a later time for the one who ultimately triumphs over the dominion of Satan. And that for Christians is Jesus. Now, there's another dream in Daniel 8 involving a goat from the west, out of which grows a little horn, which is another image of the Macedonian Greek kingdom. That goat defeats the ram, representing the kingdoms of Media and Persia, stomps on it. And out of that goat of the kingdom of Greece comes the great horn, Alexander the Great, and replacing the great horn of 4 other horns, which probably represents a division of Alexander's empire into 4 kingdoms. And out of one of those horns, which is the Seleucid Syrian kingdom, came that another horn, again a little one, another reference to Antiochus IV. He gets so powerful that he attacks Yahweh, or Michael, it's not clear in that image, by taking away the regular burnt offering, which is what we talked about, the abomination of desolation. And he overthrows the sanctuary accordingly. Then his assault is described as an assault on heaven. It threw down to earth some of the host and some of the stars and trampled on them. Even against the prince of the host, it acted arrogantly. Apparently Yahweh is meant here, although something maybe Representative Michael is meant here. It's not entirely clear. Apocalyptic imagery is not always readily transparent. The overthrow and the giving over of the sanctuary come through the transgression or rebellion of desolation. So he's making reference to the abomination of desolation, this variant term. The evil king shall destroy all the people of the holy ones, people Israel, of the holy ones, the angels. Persecution of God's people, this dream vision says, will last 1,150 days. That's roughly 3 years and 2 months, similar to what we saw in vision in chapter 7. In fact, how long does it take from the abomination of desolation being set up on the burnt offering altar in front of the temple by Antiochus to the rededication of the temple? 3 years. So apparently the image here is shortly before that will be the end. Shortly after that will be the end, the full end. Shortly after the first wave of, okay, another vision now. This one is in Daniel 9. This is the apocalypse of weeks. So shortly after the first wave of exiles have come back to Israel, Daniel is said to be puzzling over Jeremiah's prophecy. Jeremiah had a prophecy that Israel would be in exile for 70 years. It was just a round number. It's not an exact number of years, just a round number for a number of generations. Or as Daniel puts it, the number of years that must be fulfilled for the devastation of Jerusalem. This then leads Daniel to pray to Yahweh, confessing Israel's sin and Yahweh's righteousness. A very long, very helpful prayer. The extension of the 70 years is presented here in the prayer as being due to Israel's sin and unfaithfulness. Remember what it says in 2 Peter? 1,000 years is like a day with the Lord. And God can, the point being made is to the critics, is that God can, what's it to you if God postpones the end in order to magnify the number to be saved? You should rather get on your knees and face and thank God that God delayed his coming. Because when it comes, then it's final, inexorable judgment. That's how I would read it. But Daniel also prays that God's wrath would turn away from Jerusalem. Let your face shine upon the sanctuary. Your sanctuary is desolate. And the term abomination of desolation. So the angel Gabriel comes and declares what the meaning is of the 70 years of exile. 70 years really means 70 weeks of years. So each year represents 7 years, weeks of years, 7 days in a week. That means 490 years. The time decreed to finish the punishment for Israel's transgression and to atone for iniquity and to bring an everlasting righteousness and to anoint a most holy place. That is the rededication of the temple. This implies, by the way, that even though Israel is returned from exile of Babylon with the conquest by the Persian king Cyrus, that nonetheless, according to this reading, in some deeper sense, Israel remains in exile, even centuries after their return to Israel, because of sin. It becomes a metaphor for being enslaved to sin. And I would suggest he's bringing it down to the real author's own day. So 7 weeks of years, or 49 years, the text says, from the exile until the time of the anointed prince. Presumably the first return of the exiles under the Davidite Sheshbazzar. He's a Davidic descendant in 538. And that date actually works out exactly. Exiled in 587, 49 years after that, 538, that's when the first return from Babylon occurs. That's exact. So that's that must be what he means. From the time that the word went out to restore and build Jerusalem, it's probably meant the start of the exile. Most then identify this anointed prince with Zerubbabel, the Davidic governor of Judah, that comes in another return, or as co-regent, the high priest Yeshua. But if that were the case, then the 49 years don't quite work out. So it's probably Sheshbazzar, not the other two. So in other words, what I'm saying is I disagree with the common interpretation. It's probably Sheshbazzar that is meant. But the problem is after that, the chronology doesn't work out so well. There shall be 62 weeks. That is 62 more weeks after the 7 weeks. If you do the math, that's 434 years. And then an anointed one shall be cut off, and the troops of the prince who is to come, Antiochus IV, shall destroy the city. The cutting off of the anointed one probably refers to what we've talked about earlier, the removal and murder of the Zadokite high priest Onias III by Antiochus IV. That would bring us to 171. Problem is that if we actually do the calculation from the previous one, it takes us to 104 BC. Problem with that is nothing happened in 104 BC. So it appears to be we're leaving the exactitude of the precision here, as sometimes can come in prophecy. We're using round numbers here. A cipher for a centuries-long period of time. After the killing of the anointed one, then this wicked prince will, for half a week, 3.5 years, make sacrifice to Yahweh cease, right? Because it's now going to Zeus. And in their place shall be an abomination of desolation, which we saw connected with you know what event. So if the cutting off of the anointed one is the killing of Onias III in 171, this would then take us the 3.5 years to the year 168 to 167, which is the height of the persecution of Antiochus IV, and the time when the temple is desecrated in 167. So that particular part does work out, the 3.5 years, if we situate Onias III as the anointed prince that's killed, rather than Jesus. So later Christians will look at that and say Jesus is the anointed prince that's killed. But that's not the original meaning. That would be an extrapolated meaning, again, operating on a greater fulfillment model. The decreed end shall be poured out on the desolator, the wicked prince, Antiochus IV, in the final 3.5 years after that, which is in fact roughly the time in which he does die. So that's recapping what the 70 weeks of years are. I'm not going to restate it here because of the time. What I'm going to basically just summarize in a minute here, because we're up with our time here. And I will probably, what I'll do is do a little supplemental video to finish Daniel so that you can see what I do with that. And I'll send a link for you on that on YouTube, private link that you can look at. But the problem that we're getting here, as with some of the other visions, is just like with Jeremiah's vision of the 70 years of exile. It doesn't all turn out great after the 70 years. And this is true of some of the prophecies in Isaiah. So what do Jews and Christians do with that? They see the word of God still remains and endures, but God has postponed the time until such time as to accomplish his purposes more fully, probably in part due to the sin of his people leading up to that time, and planning for a more expansive view of salvation. That's how I interpret it. You may come up with a different interpretation, but that's how I deal with it. What I don't do is deny the fact of what the text seems to be saying in its historical context. I don't think I would be a good historian if I did that, or even necessarily a good believer if I did that, because I don't think the people of God at that point in time interpreted it in that way. But rather I see it as a partial fulfillment, but then the ultimate fulfillment of the end coming and the reign of the one like a son of man on earth, and the resurrection occurring, which appears in chapter 12 when it says, Michael, the angel, will arise. And when he arises, that is to do battle for Israel. And to win that battle, then the dead, some of the dead, doesn't say all the dead, some of the dead, at least the martyrs, and maybe the wise who have to do with the writing of the book of Daniel, and maybe other faithful Jews, will rise to life, but others will to death. Obviously, that didn't happen in 165. A great thing did happen in 165. The rededication of the temple, the throwing out of the Seleucid forces, which would eventually lead to independence for the nation of Israel over many more decades. but it was never fully completed. The end predicted here didn't come to pass, so it was like a pause. It wasn't an end. It wasn't would never happen. It was rather God put a pause on it. And that pause, Christians believe, would not come to fruition until the person of Jesus Christ, when the fulfillment of that vision fully takes place. And that's why Jesus and the early church appealed to these visions, because they believe that the word of God does not go out and come back empty. It goes out, God may pause the vision, but it will ultimately come to pass in a fullness that was not achieved earlier. Okay, God's blessings to you all. Anyone who has questions, I'll stay around and ask them, but of course you've been free all along to leave at any time. You are not bound. Are there any questions? Okay. No, I think they're still operating on tens, but certain numbers do have greater significance, like 7 tends to represent a certain completeness because of the influence of the Sabbath. But they're still operating on that system. But you do have what we call gematria, which is that Hebrew letters represent specific numbers. And this keys into the book of Revelation, by the way. The number 666 keys into the figure of Nero, which I can't get into now because we're not going to do Revelation for this course. But so we have that they do. But otherwise, the system is the same as what we use. Yeah.
Is that Nero, is that from a Latin translation?
Numerically, if you add up the Hebrew characters for Neron Caesar, they come to 666. And also the name for the beast, if you revert back from Greek to Hebrew, also comes to 666. So, and there's lots of imagery about Nero coming back to life as being the final evil emperor that will have to be destroyed with the return of Christ. What was the second question again? Ah, yes. Here's why. Yeah, that's a very good question. Why should you take? Because why don't we just say it's all written at the same time period as Daniel 1 to 6 centuries earlier before that, and around the time, money such as around the time of Babylon and the Medes and the Persians. It's because we didn't get to this part. It's when we get to the vision in chapters 10 to 12. That's the longest vision that we have in this section of 7 to 12. And in it, we have a very, especially in chapter 11, a very detailed presentation of what is to happen. And it all correlates with the division of the kingdoms of Alexander the Great into the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, the Greeks, and the Anatolians, and the events that then occur, especially the battles between the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria. A number of those details just correspond exactly with what we have from other historical sources. And it reaches up, the history plays out exactly until the point of the death of Antiochus. And then it doesn't quite work that way. In other words, Antiochus, the way that they describe the death of Antiochus at the end of chapter 11 isn't consistent with the reports we have elsewhere about the death of Antiochus, the location of it and the manner of the death. That he dies is, of course, but not those two elements. And of course, we didn't have the resurrection of the dead following. So in other words, what they read is say, it's accurate up until the point of the period, actually, I shouldn't say his death, just before his death. That is, we can document in all these other historical sources to that time. And then that last moment, like the last year of his life and his death, isn't substantiated by the other sources. And most scholars think at that point, that's the point in time in which it's written, because it's accurate completely up to that point. And then it doesn't appear accurate. Now, when I say that, I'm conscious of the fact, oh my God, I just raised an enormous can of worms here. in terms of inspiration and how to look at the text. All I can tell you is when I look at it and I look at the other source material we have from the ancient world, that is the way it works. I mean, I can't deny that these source materials completely follow this trajectory up until that point and then don't. Then they have a different report. And again, we don't have the resurrection occurring afterwards. We don't have the rising of Michael in a visible way, at least, that we can see. Maybe in the heavens, yes, and there's some victory over Antiochus. So when scholars look at that, they say, well, why is it accurate up to this point and not thereafter? The likelihood is because that's when it's being written. And it's a prophecy ex eventu in symbolism. Now, I'm not sure I buy all of that, but it is what I have to struggle with in working it. Why does the very end of it not quite work out? I think we can't get bogged down, for me personally, I don't get too bogged down in the details at that point, but simply say, we've come pretty much close to that point, and now God puts a pause on it, and the rest remains to be fulfilled in other ways, in a fuller way by Jesus. So, but you could say instead, and I would encourage you to think this, if you think this is where the evidence leads, the prophecy is from many centuries earlier. I don't know how to get it, explain that very last portion of it, the end of chapter 11, why that doesn't seem to jive with what we know, what else historically, but you could still, I don't know, come up with something on that. But this is what I've, and I'll say also too, the language of chapter 7 to 12 is different from 1 to 6. And a number of the loan words that appear are loan words from Greek that can't be documented prior to the 2nd century BC. So that's another indication for that. Others, yes.
I've got to run, sir. We're taking attendance.
Oh, yes, that's right. So,
Copies here.
yes. All right. You could just, someone have a piece of paper, you
I
can
was
just write
talking
your name
about
on.
that. I got an hour across town.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. Here, just put your name on here. Because Daniel, it's sort of like Moses, like David, like Solomon. These become overarching rubrics for genres of material. So for example, even though we know that the whole psalm is not, whole of the Psalms is not written by David, the Psalms itself says that, right? I mean, David writes most of the first half according to the inscriptions at the beginning, but not much of the second half. And yet when Jews refer to the Psalms or the Psalter, they refer to it as being all written by David. That's because David becomes a rubric for music because of his own renown in that field. Same thing with lots of laws come under the heading of Moses, even though they may not all have been written by Moses. But because Moses is the premier lawgiver, it comes under that name. Solomon, lots of wisdom material comes under Solomon, that many scholars would argue are not actually written by Solomon simply because of the dating of the language and some of the motifs that are used there. But they come under the rubric of Solomon because it's wisdom literature. I don't think Solomon wrote all the Proverbs in Proverbs, but he wrote a lot of Proverbs, and he was known for writing lots and lots of Proverbs. But some of the Proverbs that are in Proverbs reflect a period of time much later than Solomon and use language much later than Solomon because, and in fact, we have some texts which indicate earlier or later editions of the Proverbs. We get additional Proverbs added over time. That doesn't mean Solomon was still living, writing those Proverbs. It means that it comes under the rubric of his name. So Daniel is renowned for dream symbolism and visions. We see this in chapter 2. And so consequently, we could say, this is how I work it, but again, you don't have to work it this way, is that subsequent dream symbolism is then connected with this figure because he's the sort of patron of all dream symbolism, in a sense. That's how I work it. God's blessings. Yes. No, he's supposed to, according to Revelation, already be thrown down. Yes, that's right. Does that make you feel better? That he's here? Yeah, that is.
When Michael, when he was thrown down, that was, we don't even know exactly what he was thrown. Emphasis on the Bible at times it could have happened, but we don't know exactly.
It seems to be associated with Jesus' ascension in Revelation. Jesus comes to the right hand of God the Father, There's a battle in the heavenly realms. Satan is thrown down.
So, you mean he's going back up? He's on earth now. Oh, you mean?
No, Satan's not going back up. Satan's now on earth. Jesus went up to heaven and Satan went down to earth. Jesus comes down, Satan, according to Revelation, is going to be bound for 1,000 years, a millennium. And then after which time there'll be a final great battle. And then he's going to be thrown in the lake of fire. Doesn't have to mean. Generally, biblical numerology like that is symbolic. Right. Yeah, in a larger sense, God rules and Christ rules. But Satan is the Lord of this world. Right.
Okay, so Thomas, last question. Does the trip to do the ascension for the godly or other Christ happen before the millennium?
Yes. Oh, very much so. Yeah, Christ has been on earth, gone back to heaven, and then there's the persecutions, and then ultimately, yes, that.
We're not here during the reign.
Right. There are different views about that, I'll say. But if you're asking me what the writer of Revelation seems to be saying, I don't see how people can put, although some put the millennium as metaphorically the period of the church. I just don't think it works with the book of Revelation. That's not the way it's presented in the book of Revelation. But others have a different view of that issue. So we have.
You believe that we're going forward, that Christians are we go before, right? I mean,
Oh, are we raptured before
right.
the millennium?
Yes.
No, I don't believe that that is the case.
Okay, so you think we're here during the millennium?
Yeah,
If
I
you're
guess.
alive, if you were
Right,
alive. Okay,
yeah.
well, that would be kind of cool, actually. I kinda like that. But there's not a clear.
I think, I mean, I'm drawing a memory here and I'm tired late at night, but I think, yes,
Okay.
tentatively,
And then-
I'll say that.
And then most Jews before Christ and everybody else still died. I mean, there's no heaven or anything like that because that was still going through the sins of Adam and Eve up until Christ.
There is a great judgment when Christ comes, which inaugurates the millennium.
Yeah.
So I'd have to go back and look at that.
You know, up until Jesus Christ, most people, because when we left because of the sin of the garden, just have died and are dead forever. Is there a hell for them from that day or no?
The image presented in the New Testament is that there is a resurrection to judgment.
Okay, for everybody.
For everybody.
Okay, well,
That's
actually
expanded beyond
and he will
the sum of
reveal
Daniel 12.
every one of what
That's
he
right.
did
The
and
thoughts of everybody's hearts will be revealed and there'll be a judgment that will take
for
place.
every human being.
And some, that's right. And some will go into everlasting judgment and some will go into everlasting life. Now,
Right.
as to what that everlasting judgment is, there's further debate about
Yeah,
that.
okay,
Yeah.
Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
you just don't want to be on that side.
I don't want to be on.
Yeah, that's right. That's all we need to know.
Yeah.
That's
All
the
right.
original Steve.
Yeah. Now, are you surveying or taking it for credit?
I'll take it for credit.
Okay, then I want your name down on this.
Okay, no problem. Yeah.
And next time you can sit up front
Okay, yeah,
and come on time.
you know, it's funny,
What time did you come?
I got here at like 6, I was lost. Nobody knew where the class was. I called HBU,
Oh,
I
really?
called First, Second Baptist, nobody.
Well, you knew it
knew.
was at Second Baptist.
Yeah, I was
right?
here on 6:30, but I couldn't
Yeah.
find it.
Okay.
I went from seeing, you know, yeah, I was here, I got it like, I think 6:30, 6:40.